I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the second edition of AD&D. Now, when we last left off, we were, of course, talking about encounters, and we started talking about random encounters. Let's talk about random encounter tables today. Because before we go about making our own random encounter tables, there's some things we have to think about that are very important. Once we thought about these things, we can go about making our own. But first, there are some key concepts that we're going to have to discuss. The fact is, first thing, you're not going to just want one all-encompassing table for everything you do. Now, yes, it's simpler that I could have this random encounter chart and it would last for everywhere I visit. But it removes a level of dynamic and detail to your world. Effectively, by making random encounter tables fitting more of your exact areas you're going to, it makes those random encounters feel as if they're part of the story, part of everything that's going on. Now, very easily, I could take a terrain-based random encounter table, one that already exists, or come up with one on my own. The fact is, this is still a generalization. Maybe it's not as general as the other one before, but if I'm in a certain region or a certain place, maybe there might be something else I might encounter there. There could be a city somewhere within this desert that if I'm near that city, it might be appropriate for me to meet some kind of NPC that the normal encounter table wouldn't have had for the desert. But it seems appropriate and might be even likely. So you can see that customizing these charts, these tables, for each of the various places that you're going to adventure and possibly have to deal with them, can be very critical on establishing these regions and making them feel more alive. You also have to consider things like level of civilization, the amount of danger that's going to be around the characters, and the level of magic. All of these things affect what kind of creatures and a chance of these creatures being encountered by your players. You have to consider each very carefully when you're building this chart, and that's the level that the chart should reflect. This is reflecting an entire terrain that answering those three questions have just gotten you a basic idea of. Now your players, they're not going to see the entire chart ever. They're probably not going to encounter everything you put on that. But it's the fact that you built it that helps you make the world you're building more alive. You have a better concept of this world you're building, and therefore can build it a little easier because you've thought of these things that make it easier for you to keep consistency of your world. Now, there are a couple of other things that we're going to talk about when we're talking about these. First off, frequency. Now, what's frequency? Well, every monster has basically a basic frequency that they mention that you can encounter these. When I'm talking about encountering these within a random area, making a random encounter table, what all of these effectively mean is that of 100% time of encountering any of these, a common creature, 70% of the time. Uncommon, 20. A rare, 7, and a very rare, 3. Unique is the exception here. As unique, there's, well, one of. It's unique. You really shouldn't put a unique encounter on a random encounter chart. Random encounter charts for just that, random encounters. Planned encounters are really the place for a unique encounter. Not to say that you couldn't come up with a great reason behind it. Maybe you could, like a unique monster goes on patrol occasionally and maybe you meet him outside of his lair. That might be something. Or meeting him in his lair. But I almost feel like you want to plan more of that random encounter out, so it's somewhere in between. It's random if they meet it, but you want to plan it out if they actually hit that encounter. See what I'm talking about? That's why unique creatures aren't really made for the chart. Now the fact is, just because these things have this frequency doesn't mean they actually have this frequency. You have to take into account the terrain and climate. If a polar bear has a frequency of X, if I place it in a jungle, you're not going to find a goddamn polar bear in a jungle. Why are you even thinking about that? It's ridiculous. So you can see the frequency doesn't always match the terrain. Also, the rarity of that, if I'm saying there's very rare encounters, if there's some kind of magical creature, and guess what? I just made this super magical valley where all these magical creatures exist. Maybe it's a lot more common. It makes sense there. Or Dinosaurs! How about dinosaurs? You never find dinosaurs anywhere else. I have a Lost Valley. It's filled with dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are going to be the random encounter. Other places? No. So you can see the climate, the terrain, the very setting you're coming up with heavily affects the frequency of these encounters that you're going to have. The easiest way to define this is, I'm coming up with a demographic of what lives in this valley, what lives in this territory, what lives in this dungeon, and I'm reflecting it with my random encounter chart. The chances of meeting something from this chart are based upon that demographic. Next thing we have to consider is logic. And what do I mean by logic? Does whatever I'm putting on this chart make sense if they encounter it? The polar bear in the jungle doesn't make sense. Now granted, I could come up with this awesome storyline of why there's a group of polar bears living in this jungle and they haven't died off. And if some players somehow learn that, but it's a stretch. I don't need to stretch things that difficult. I can just keep things quiet and logical. This works here, that works there, this doesn't work here. By keeping it logical, it makes it feel like whatever you're facing fits in properly with this world. That I'm keeping consistency between my storylines, between my world as it exists. And then it makes more sense, and people are grasping onto it and feeling like they're actually exploring a world. If you're getting in a place that might have societal-based encounters, then the type of NPCs that you might encounter, it's important to define those. To define that I'm in an area where civilization is. I might encounter civilization itself, some kind of NPCs. Who are they? What are they? Why are they there? Do they make sense in this region? If it's an area that doesn't have any kind of civilization, just wilderness or underground, what's the ecology? So it's just like that society before, that hierarchy of society. Guess what? What feeds on what around here? What's the top of the food chain? What's the bottom of the food chain? Asking these questions can help you not only with that frequency before, because usually top predators, there's less of them, but it also helps with logic, because what is that feeding on, this creature I'm putting on here? You know, it might make sense region-wise, but what do I have here that it would feed on? What would it eat that there'd be so many of them to be a population? Granted, there might not be a lot of them, but it's still a population. We talked about that with the frequency that you're making these populations. So keeping this link between all of them to a degree is helping to establish this logic between the entire thing, and I'm establishing this setting better. Last thing we're going to talk about. Effect. What do I mean by effect? Well, of course, the effect is going to be how your creature fits into all of this. Now, you don't want this random encounter to necessarily affect your story, your plot, your characters as a whole. You don't want any of them to be more exciting than the adventures they have that are planned out by you. You want them just to be something that is there. And you have reasons for having it there. But the effect of it shouldn't be a major one on the overall mission. What these should be is things you have in between everything else that are either used to increase tension or possibly decrease it. If you have an encounter that might break the tension a little bit and you want to, bam. Or if all of a sudden they've taxed for some abilities and they're getting weaker and they might not have enough for that final boss and they have a random encounter which injures them some more, it increases that tension because they just used resources to fight this thing. That's another thing you can do with these. Wear down your players. Because guess what? You might have a certain number of encounters that you're planning. And if they're not using up enough resources, you plan for them to be this taxed when they got to here. Guess what? If they're not, random encounter eats away at those resources, makes that big final battle all the much more dangerous and deadly because they've weakened by all these little random encounters breaking away at their strength. You never want to make a random encounter deadly, though. These should be at most difficult and taxing on your players, but never deadly. They're made to, of course, wear them down at most. They can also be used in a way then as this threat. If your characters aren't at peak and they know a random encounter could happen, that's tension just by the sheer threat of the random encounter. The sheer fact that they could hit something, and in their weakened state, they might not be in a shape to beat it, and they're worried about that. So you can see there's another level entirely here to the random encounters. The fact that you have them can add to that tension you want for a part of an adventure. That they're trying to move through that, and are we going to get hit? Are we going to fail? Now, random encounters aren't always resolved. Now, it's important that you do not use your most powerful and significant creatures when you're building around random encounters. Those should be the ones you're using for your planned encounters. That's a part of this here, because you're making it that the threat is there, but those significant threats and those significant obstacles to overcome are going to be the planned ones. You're going to want to make it just that right bit of threat, but without, pushing it to that level that makes it feel like it should be part of the story, rather than just an encounter. So, that's it for today. I talked about building a random encounter tables, but I didn't talk necessarily about actually building them. I talked about what you need to know as a dungeon master before you go and think about building a random encounter table. You have a number of things you have to consider. You have to consider the basic environment you're building in. You should make a random encounter table that you can make a general one for like every desert you're going to use. Customize it then. Customize it to your whim, to whatever fills with the area you're making that encounter for. So that if I visit Desert 1, it's going to have a slightly different table than Desert 2. There might be some overlap, but by customizing it, it fits better. Don't keep a general encounter table for everything. It's going to be boring. It's going to detract from your game. Because then we ask 3 important questions. 1. Frequency. How often these creatures are going to be encountered. That's the first big thing you have to consider for everything you're going to be throwing out there. And by asking questions about the region, you might alter some of the base frequencies of these monsters to fit with the region you're building. Then, logic. Does it make sense what I've thrown in here fits within this area? Does it fit within the society if it's more a civilized area? Does it fit within the ecology if it's a wilderness area? How does this, whatever it is, fit in here? Does it match the climate? Does it match the terrain? Does it match everything? Does it make sense? Finally, the last one of these, what kind of effect is it going to have on your players to have it? It should have an effect. And that's what's making it important. It should have an effect. It shouldn't just be a throwaway. It shouldn't just be something that overwhelms your characters, but it should have an effect without overshadowing the adventure. In the next episode, we're going to learn how to make a random encounter table finally. We've hit that point in time, and that's what we're going to discuss. Now that we know our basics. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.